settling in so properly that I think we might just start a few minutes early, which hopefully gives us a bit more time for discussion. Welcome to the session on significance, the issue of significance, or possibly significances, perhaps following on from the discussion in the last session. I'm not entirely clear of the distinction between a panel and a round table, but the way that we're going to run this particular session is that we've got five panel members. They're going to give us about a 10-minute maximum short introduction from each of their individual perspectives. And then there should be, hopefully if we stick to that time schedule, a good sort of 50 minutes for discussion, making sure that we finish at 5:30. Most of the speakers have got PowerPoint presentations to illuminate their presentation. And we're just going to run through them in the order that they are in the programme. Our first speaker is Roger Bowdler, who was referred to earlier on as the man from the ministry, in his role as designation director at English Heritage. Over to you, Roger.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to the organisers. It's a really good combination of people in this room. Exciting. I'm not the man from the ministry, because I'm not at the ministry, I'm at English Heritage, but I am paid for by the taxpayer, so I've got some responsibility to present a very straightforward, earnest, respectable view. Do the best. Doing the PowerPoint. Right, here are two images of some long-haired, bearded men. And on the left, actually, whole families, women too. This is the point of this slide to give you a sense of the range of what historic environment. Can we use the word history even? Don't know. Environment, is that allowed? I think it is. The range of the stuff we cover and the duty we have as taxpayers, champions of that which deserves protection in a fast-changing world, to identify, spot it, look after it, do something about it, promote understanding, and so forth. And it goes from Star Car, North Yorkshire, Middle Stone Age sites, to Abbey Road. The range of stuff we're looking at, which people believe warrants respect in the planning system, is phenomenally wide. So another of the points I'd like to make is the point I made earlier about the need to communicate specialist interest, get out of the straitjacket of minute specialisations, and communicate the interest and fascination of history, prehistory, in its widest sense, to as many people as we possibly can. Now, 1913, it's the centenary of that act that began, that was ambitious in its time. The agenda for us is one of moving with the times, keeping up about what people value. Ask 8 different people, you get 8 different things. But they're probably all agree Stonehenge is quite interesting. I think that's the point to hang on to. There are some shared acceptances of what matters. Now, this idea of triggering specific control and protection through the planning system is often prompted by designation. It's a really important bit of English Heritage's duty. That's why they're paid by government. Now, I'm probably addressing myself to the historians and historical geographers in the audience more than the conservation specialists now. Because in my experience, it's quite rare for people to know both sides of the fence. So if it's a straightforward lecture about designation, I do need to introduce some things to you. Those of you who know this stuff, easy peasy, heard that for years, have a little switch off. The quantity, the sheer mass of assets that have been protected and identified through legal statutory processes agreed to by Parliament, and remember that, anti-regulation people, Parliament's agreed this stuff, is very high. Nearly 380,000 entries on the list. It's about 500,000 buildings. The National Heritage List for England has completely transformed how we present what is protected through the designations, what is indeed deemed to be of special interest or national importance. And those of you who've already availed yourself of an EH bookmark, the nearest I can do to a crackerjack pencil, an EH bookmark, there's a pile of them outside in the entrance desk. The good thing about these is they have the links to the website, so you know how to get hold of the National Heritage List for England, and so forth. So please, everyone, I will be checking tomorrow if you've got one. Scheduling, much smaller amount, less than 20,000 items, even though we've been doing it since 1882. We do it very thoroughly, however. Western Parks and Gardens, battlefields we haven't done much about today. I got a cold, a terrible cold, caught at Verdun on Friday, so forgive me. Rex. Now, what's happened to marine in this discussion? Nowhere, not yet. And World Heritage Sites. Many different ways of protecting, many different consequences. We did have a go at bringing these different ways of protecting different sorts of assets together. The first decade of the 21st century was spent the Heritage Protection Review, got a parliamentary bill, not enacted, not likely to be. We worked very hard to get it. We are where we are. So these quite ancient tools remain valid, and I believe incredibly useful contributions to the managing of change in a fast-changing world. Now, assigning significance. That's what this slot is about. I kind of think in my middle-brow moments, of which there are quite a few, there's an easy way to do this and a very difficult, tricky way to do it. The other wise panellists, round-tablers, can do the sophisticated bit. Significance to me in a fast-changing, busy world. Does it matter? Will its loss cause us deep and profound concern? Do we need to take extra steps to uphold its interest? Is it significant? One way of reading it. The precise legal definitions of what makes for significance in the different designation regimes are somewhat different, but amount to a pretty similar thing. In listing, it's a special interest on historical or architectural grounds. Scheduling much wider, artistic, traditional feature as well. And the definition for significance is national importance. Is it of national importance? Sorry, Graham, the concept of nation will pop up occasionally. Listing's got grading, of course. You've got a hierarchy of significance, with the outstanding level being grade 1, which is something like less than 4% of things on the list are grade 1. Photos and house, for instance. Scheduling doesn't have it, however. Very hard to predict just how interesting something is, unless you've excavated it to death. Now, some of the ways that we've been working, the emphases we've been putting on our work, is trying to explain much more clearly to the user, the recipient, sometimes the unwilling recipient of a designation. And in the past, the issue of designation was purely to identify something. Didn't need extra care in the planning system, in essence. Our mission has been much more about communication. Why does it warrant extra care? Why are we seeing the loss of the private individual's freedom to enjoy their property as they see fit? And that was a really important driver behind the Heritage Protection Review, still very much with us. So some of the things we've been about have resulted from that work. We do assess things much more fully. What are the claims to note? Let's explain it rather than just telling the owner what the outside of their building looks like. That's not good enough. You don't carry people with you. So we now, when we're issuing our designation documentation, there are reasons as to why it's got that legal protection. It didn't used to happen. You want some background, selection guides, come on to that later. And above all, you've got to influence decision makers and broaden owner appreciation. We've heard a lot about involving more people, couldn't agree more. And the list used to be a very dry document in planning departments. We see it as a resource, a celebration of nearly 400,000 things that warrant protection. Selection guides, touched on those really quickly. We've been working very hard to try and build up a shared understanding of what warrants assets getting that extra protection. And the listing system was pretty occult in the old days. Why? Why was that one listed? I have a clue. Trust me, I know. Deal with it. You've got to explain how you go about your business much more these days. So not only do we have introductions to the different categories of asset, tiny potted history, hardly the last word, but they're an introduction. We now explain what it is that we look for. What are the tests for listing a 19th century gasometer? Well, we'll give you a clue. Earliness, ecological virtuosity, group setting, all sorts of things. So different categories, different questions are asked, that's where to find out. And there are also introductions to heritage assets, just introductions to appreciation. Because one of the points made forcibly by Malcolm is that the old days, a very experienced cadre of interpreters in the planning system is on the way. Planning officers, much more now, generalists, often without heritage qualifications, which is quite worrying. So we have to explain much more what significance looks like. Make it approachable, make it accessible, and above all, make it usable. So not the last word. I'm not going to be made an FBA with this stuff, but that's not really my mission. It's to switch people on. In the old days, the designations, these marvellous things, appeared on paper. They were scruffy documents in local planning offices. They were very rare, very hard to get hold of. And the last paper one we issued, or the DCMS issued, because remember, it's not English Heritage that does the listing, it's the DCMS, the Secretary of State decides. Still do, and most of them decide with 99.89 of our recommendations. Hooray. This used to be on paper. Very rare, as I mentioned. It's now on the web. Originally, we talked about the importance of the web, being aware of the 21st century means of reaching people. This stuff is now available. It's up for public scrutiny. People can spend their weekends browsing through. A few do, we noticed from our interrogation of who's looking. This day of the paper thing, only of interest to planners, is over. We think there's a much broader audience about that. One of the challenges, however, of revealing this stuff to the world, before it was pretty occult, is that a lot of this stuff is really quite old. I don't know, can you read those date brackets? The pinky red bits mean the date was issued in 1980 or before. Most of them are sort of yellowish buttermilky colour, and that means from 1980 to 1995. And the happy but rather sparse green ones are after 95. Values change, understanding grows massively. It's very exciting, if nervous-making for me, to watch how much extra understanding there is. Just look at the difference between edition 1 and edition 2 of Bill's Vignan volume. Astonishing. How do we keep up with what is captured on the list? Is it a fair encapsulation of the heritage assets that we believe were an extra care in the planning system? Well, generally they're not bad. There are some pretty patchy ones, some fairly dodgy ones, a tiny minority. Overall, it's an incredibly impressive achievement. It's not one I want to undermine, and urge you all to consider undermining the authority of the list by knocking it too hard. Because there are lots of anti-regulation people out there who would love this to be knocked. So careful what you wish for. The reason we haven't overhauled lots of these and don't overhaul them frequently and magnificently is because it's much, much slower how we go about doing our business. We work hard on explaining why things of interest. We also want to deal with people better. Another heritage protection reform thing, we now tell people we're looking at their asset for consideration for listing or scheduling. We involve them. And consultation, as those of you who do consultation rather than just talk about it, will know how tiring it is. Great and fulfilling, but please maybe realistic about what's possible. Yeah? There's a tendency for glibness when it comes to consulting. I just want to flag that risk. Consultation done properly is very time consuming. So that's why we don't go sweeping our way through redoing it regularly in a cavalier manner. You can't. Totally different how you deal with people now. 1 minute. 1 minute. You're really lucky. Knowing where you stand, really, really important. Things are changing all the time, they're falling into the sea, people want to build on valuable property. What are the heritage constraints? They've got to know, okay? You've got to know. So a sort of loose, woolly plurality of values doesn't really help sort out Battersea Power Station. I would urge us all to remember that. Defining the threshold. Is this still really, really old? Values change. Some of these cases involve some really intense skirmishing between us, between owners and planners. No one knows the heritage significance of the mid-19th century pub with an attached pleasure ground behind. There's no PhD in it, no one knows. We've got to come up with a pretty quick assessment, does that matter, and incur considerable real estate grief in so doing. So there is a pressure around this stuff, but it's a very fulfilling way of being a historian. Now this next one, I'm so relieved it's there we are, this one's for Kate Clark. Significance beyond the red dots. Everyone knows there are lots of things out there that haven't been bagged by some designator, has no red dots. Overwhelmingly true with archaeology. We're constantly discovering new things. The potential for this country to reveal stuff phenomenal. Not everything by a long, long way is scheduled. That's very selective. Thetford Dockyard case in point. Henrican Foundation, Sayes Court is next door, we heard about that earlier on. Very limited numbers of listings and schedulings here. This stuff is protected through the planning system. So I know there is life outside the red dot in terms of respecting significance. And this is the sort of poor old me slide, because there is so much pressure to establish what things matter. And to leave it hanging in the air doesn't really do. Some of the stuff we do is profoundly positive and upbeat. The listing of the Lloyds builder was totally happy. brilliant statements from Richard Rogers. The owners were really pleased. It was great. Harperley, the prisoner of war camp in the middle, in the stolen slide. Second World War prisoner of war camp. Fascinating, falling a bit. Let's say the matters, let's get the slide up. C, the coastal one, the dreaded Perth and Hulls. Yeah, I believe in managed decay as well, so let's hear it for poetic decay as well. But actually, some of this stuff is of such an order, it's got to be flagged. Or there are ne'er-do-wells who get rid of it. Gasometers, how we run gas has completely changed. Infrastructure, massive government priority, where do you stand? So we've got a system of heritage protection that articulates significance, profoundly impressive in its scale, its scope and extent. We've got to be careful in an anti-regulatory age about where it's going. Enough.
Okay, thanks so much, Roger. Our next speaker is David Adshead, who's head curator at National Trust.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to have quite the same rigour as Dr. Bowdler, but this is by way of a few visual prompts, really, and I'm going to dab around mostly the National Trust and give you a few examples. Well, a few years ago, news of the intended demolition of Gateshead's brutalist Trinity Square car park, designed in 1962 by the Owen Luder Partnership, complete with a never-to-be tenanted rooftop cafe, provoked a lively debate about its significance. Malcolm Ayres earlier on touched on the impact that the demolition of buildings can have on public opinion. The 20th Century Society championed its cause and was joined by film buffs, many of whom had never been to Gateshead. Among them, the Hollywood actor, and I put that in inverted commas, Sylvester Stallone. The building was not listed, and many local people felt that it had long blighted the air. The primary appeal of the car park, which featured in the 1972 film Get Carter, starring Michael Caine, was of course associative. In a BBC poll, 16% of participants felt it should be preserved. 76% thought it should be demolished, while the remaining 8% favoured. Finally demolished in 2010, fragments were sold in special commemorative tins for £5. Its significance had been atomised and commodified, but in another way it lives on in that film and in memories. This is just one of an infinite number of examples that might be chosen to demonstrate how differently different people respond to places. Are places and things imbued with intrinsic significance, or is significance cultural, imposed, a function of our individual perceptions? That's a very old chestnut. A traditional view might argue for the former, and that innate qualities are enduring. Today, it is generally accepted that significance is mutable and in the eye of the beholder. Though, of course, many human experiences are universal. But our recognition of significance, or the value that we place on things, depends on an understanding of what we're looking at. I'll give you an example. On the National Trust beach at Formby Point in Merseyside, there are two sets of footprints, those of an adult and an accompanying child. They're prosaic, everyday, ephemeral, but they only appeared following a storm and proved to have been made some 5 millennia ago. This is electrifying stuff. By this discovery, another layer of significance has been added, quite literally by man's imprint. But these remarkable footprints could not have been known about when the landscape was considered significant enough to be acquired for permanent preservation for the benefit of the nation. Understanding of significance can and do, of course, evolve. Whether this is enhancement or an additional significance, I leave it to you. And I think that little formula at the bottom, which I think comes from a sort of cultural, geographical approach, I find quite useful, limited to. A microscopic example of this, which I draw on from my own experience, is a cottage in the Cambridgeshire Fen, Wickham. In 1988, overseeing its rescue from near collapse, repairing it in traditional materials and furnishing and presenting it to the visiting public for educational purposes was one of my first tasks for the National Trust. The first few acres of Wickham Fen, one of the most important surviving areas of wetland in Europe, were acquired in 1899. the cottage only in 1974, and then only in order to protect the approach to the nature reserve from inappropriate development. It was of absolutely no interest to the biologists, many of them academics from Cambridge, who ran the local committee. But with its vernacular materials, sedge, reed, clay bat and sun-dried turf blocks, and its ability to speak of the social history of the fen, its rescue from behind a sleeping beauty thicket of thorns and exoskeleton of wriggly tin, it's added immeasurably to an appreciation of the significance of the place. Now to the question which we posed about selection. If the production of a statutory list of buildings and sites deemed worthy of protection has been a complex and ongoing undertaking for government, so has been the business of agreeing what might be acquired for preservation and perpetuity with the charitable funds of the National Trust. Those now in state guardianship may be considered a collection, but those cared for by the Trust might more honestly be described as an accretion, though the process itself is informed by understanding. And the starting point has always been the principle that the National Trust provides a safety net of last resort. The nature of the threat and the opportunities afforded to and priorities established by each successive generation have inevitably varied. And we heard this first thing this morning about some of the social, economic and legislative factors that influence the availability of properties in the early 20th century. Passionate and persuasive individuals, for example Lord Curzon, have also shaped thinking along the way. But for all generations, the powerful tool of inalienability conferred on the National Trust by an Act of Parliament in 1907 has been essential in giving confidence to take the longest possible management view. In the 1930s, what John Comforth described as the cult of the castle and the manor house prevailed. At the end of that decade, a list of country houses considered by the National Trust as of first importance was drawn up by Sir Charles Peers, Christopher Hussey and Lord Gerald Wellesley, mentioned in Simon's book. And so the tradition in the National Trust of list-making, not mandatory of course, has continued. The architectural historians Mark Gerard, Colin Amery and Alan Powers have all successively advised the National Trust about different categories and periods of buildings, Victorian, Edwardian and modern movement, and have produced lists and reports that have guided the committees in their work. Tinsfield, acquired a few years ago, for example, appeared in the top category of Mark Gerard's list in 1975. The most recent thematic study that I can think of, drawing on a body of research undertaken by the then Royal Commission on Historic Monuments for England, was on workhouses and preceded the Trust's acquisition of the workhouse at Southall. So we were both opportunistic, informed and selective on that occasion. Acquisitions such as the Beatles houses, seen by some observers as marking a change in the Trust's direction, in my mind, are really no different from the tradition of the literary shrine or the place associated with the celebrated, venerated individual. Their significance in current language, or rather their relevance, is capable of fading fast. Think of Benjamin Disraeli and Thomas Carlyle, key figures in Victorian Britain. We look after both their houses, and now rarely in the public consciousness, and that makes their interpretation a great challenge. As we heard in the last session, language has inevitably changed too over the last century or more. In a chapter entitled The Virtues of Architecture in his Stones of Venice, published in 1851-3, John Ruskin argued that, just as with people, we need from buildings two kinds of goodness, that they do their practical duty well, and that they are graceful and pleasing in doing it. The practical, he suggested, could be divided into acting and talking. Acting as to defend us from weather or violence, talking as the duty of monuments or tombs to record facts and express feelings, or of churches, temples, public edifices, treated as books of history, to tell such history clearly and forcibly. This might be translated to an assessment of significance. But architecture parlante was hardly a new idea in Ruskin's day, and traces of 18th century aesthetic theory and earlier notions that derive from theological discussion are recognisable in today's discussions of significance. I don't expect you to read that. In 1945, a small book, The National Trust, a record of 50 years' achievement, was published to celebrate its jubilee. John Summerson contributed a chapter on town buildings, rather idiosyncratically applying his own theoretical acquisition criteria to properties already in the Trust's care, development of ideas he had already presented to the Architectural Association. He proposed 5 categories for buildings that might be considered worthy of preservation, and there they are. And it's in a language of its day. In his illuminating essay on the National Trust and the National Heritage, in his book In Churchill's Shadow, Confronting the Past in Modern Britain, David Cannadine suggests that the history of the National Trust, bound up with that of the nations, might be divided into 4 phases, each of which overlaps to a greater or lesser extent with the others, with changing values and priorities, different interpretations and projections of our patrimony inevitably emerge. And these are they. 1, 1895 to 1920. I'm going to change the slide because you're going to look at that and it's not going to confuse you. 1895 to 1920, preservation of open spaces, which he categorised as liberal intellectual. 1914 to 1949, the proclamation of spiritual values, which he thought was Baldwinite Tory. Third, 1935 to 1970, a preoccupation with rescuing country house reactionary. And lastly, 1985 to the present day, a commitment to safeguarding the environment, environmentalist eclectic. In addition to having statements of significance for each of its properties, the National Trust now requires its managers to think about a spirit of place, or genius loci. The earliest properties were acquired nearly 120 years ago, and in order that well-intentioned management developments, in response to ever-increasing pressures of access, we don't erode their essence and can steer an expression of the past safely into the future, and we define the conservation as the careful management of change. We've developed this notion of spirit of place, and this is in that sort of tradition of contrasted views. It's from one of theoretical publications, and it always pops into my mind when I see something beautiful about to be changed for no particularly good reason. And if you understand the essence of that, you know what to do to ensure that is steered into the future. We also use 3 simple questions. What is unique, distinctive, and cherished? That's imported from the lexicon of UNESCO, ICOMOS, which helps property managers to explore and define the quiddity of each place. And I think that probably captures what CADU talks about in its conservation principles, looking at evidential values, historical values, aesthetic values, and community values. And I also find common grounds rules for local distinctiveness incredibly valuable, free from having to have huge national responsibilities or official them. They're able to express their ideas as a simple A to Z, an alphabet, which is full of poetry. I commend it to you. And that helps, I think, us save ourselves from ourselves and from the dangers of homogeneity, which we talked about earlier on. My final slide. As we saw in Gateshead, the spectre of destruction sharpens our passions and opens our eyes to what may be right before us. The devastation of war can reaffirm and redefine what we view as significant. So I'll end these brief observations with some images of Stari Most, the mid-16th century Ottoman bridge at Mostar, willfully destroyed during the Croat Bosnian War because of its great cultural significance and symbolic role in linking physically and emblematically the town's Christian and Muslim communities. This was the first instance in which the deliberate destruction of cultural property, labelled killing memory by the United Nations, was accounted for in The Hague as a war crime under the 1954 Hague Convention. And here we feel the bite of international protective legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Our next presentation is from Paul Brewery, which has just been set up for us now. Paul is in private practice but has extensive experience, including involvement in the drafting of the conservation principles. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you. Right. I want to talk about the evolving scope of significance, primarily through post-war documents from the last 30 or 40 years, which I think have been influential in our thinking in the UK. In English legislation, of course, the idea of significance potentially deriving from a range of heritage values is actually most inclusive in the wording of the 1913 and subsequent acts. But unfortunately, as we heard this morning from Simon, its wide application to all those categories listed was thwarted by landed interests in the Lords and the infamous Dean Street case. After that, really, in practice, archaeological interest was perceived by archaeologists, and later, under listing, architectural interest perceived by architectural historians. And these became the basis of protection, with actually even the historic interest taking very much a second place. I think the scope of recognised significance really began to widen, as again was mentioned this morning, with the conservation areas the Civic Amenities Act 1967 that introduced conservation areas, allowing special interests to be determined in the local context. And it was soon, and actually contrary to the government's intention, embraced the familiar and cherished local scene, those familiar words from circulars over many years. In fact, the circular that accompanied the Civic Amenities Act, guidance to local authorities, at first saw a very small and finite number of conservation areas being designated to protect the settings of groups of outstanding listed buildings. The next circular, a year later, was completely different in the context of the 68 provisions for listing. Sorry, this thing doesn't seem to...
Oh, you can use the arrows on the keyboard too.
Sorry?
You can use the arrows on the keyboard if that's easier.
Oh, right, that's easier, yes. Okay. The Borough Charter. Here I must mention Kate Clark, who's present, who's been a thread through the influence of Borough in Europe and the UK over many years. I think professional perception of the need to place established concerns in the wider context of cultural heritage and cultural significance first emerged in relation to the European heritage of Australia, where age, of course, was less important as the key criterion of value. The Borough Charter, first drafted, I think, in 1979, set out a process of understanding a place and the cultural values attached to it, emphasising that those values are assigned by people, not intrinsic, and that they evolve through time. And also, inevitably, as discussed this morning, they're intangible. Assessing significance in these terms is, of course, as with listing, a means to an end, managing change in ways that will retain or sustain all aspects of cultural significance. These ideas were taken up in the Council of Europe Cultural Heritage Committee, of which around 2000 I was the UK rep and ultimately chair. And the Council of Europe, of course, and that committee familiar to you from the Granada and Valletta Conventions, and the body, the Council of Europe, is concerned ultimately with human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. The ideas that are on the screen came out of the European context of contested heritage, the legacy of World War II, which inevitably was being revisited in the wake of the unification of Berlin, and of course the recent Balkan conflict, which we saw on the screen a moment ago. So the resolution reflects a human rights dimension. People should have the right to identify if, why, to what extent places are significant to them, rather than accept a state-imposed narrative, which again was very much an issue at that time. These ideas were worked up within the Fareham Convention, by which time I think we could recognise in
the recitals of the convention, those generally accepted premises on which the articles of the convention were based, two crucial concepts. First, and I think most importantly, the need to put people and human values at the centre of an enlarged and cross-disciplinary concept of cultural heritage. And second, the need to try to involve everyone in defining and managing the heritage. And this, again, the context, of course, was post-communist Eastern Europe, where the parallel of today, perhaps, was the rapid decline of state support for cultural heritage. And the significance of the Faro Convention, I leave you to read the first point. It wasn't perhaps exactly a triumph of international drafting skills, but I think it conveys the idea, including, of course, the historic environment in the final sentence, which had to be spelled out rather than our shorthand used. And this also articulates the idea of heritage communities, whether defined by locality or interest. We then had the honour, pleasure, whatever, of being involved in helping English Heritage draft the conservation principles, which of course were influenced by these two earlier documents. And I think we were far clearer here in using a simple definition of heritage to embrace both cultural and natural dimensions, and a refined version of the Faro definition of cultural heritage. And notice in the light of what was said earlier, the emphasis in the final line and of their understanding of the beliefs and traditions of others. Heritage can be about understanding others in a deeper way, as well as one's own origins, background, identity. We set up some value groups here. There are a huge number of published classifications, surveys of heritage values. They agree on very little, apart from usually discriminating between in heritage values and instrumental values that derive from them, and some don't even do that. I think we intended these groups simply as prompts to thought about the potential range of those interrelated values and places that one might identify. Certainly not mutually exclusive, and certainly not intended to be taken up as a universal checklist, which one so often sees. Of these, communal value, being the furthest from professional judgment, is the hardest to capture, the hardest to sustain, but the easiest to find out when you've gone wrong, when people get upset about it. And then, of course, we move on to our own national planning and policy framework via PPS 5, which at least introduced a values-based or significance-led approach to statutory heritage conservation. But the terminology, of course, remains selectively rooted in the old legislation, and I think the operative definition of archaeological is particularly awkward here. I agree with what was said this morning. Archaeology is a technique for examining, understanding, studying the physical remains of the past. But at least significance is now in national policy, even if it's limited to a narrower range of values than in the 1913 Act, tradition, of course, being omitted, let alone those envisaged in Borough and Faro. In practice, as Roger said, the system is proving flexible, where historical association is able to embrace the communal values of buildings like Brixton Market and even indeed the Abbey Road crossing, which we saw. So, final thought. The HLF's definition of heritage, which we heard earlier, follows really in the Faro principles line, and their policy is inclusive. It's heritage if it's valued by people. Significance then, fundamentally, is how we articulate the values that people and communities attach to heritage. And the thinking that I've outlined, I think, is often characterised as a kind of democratisation of heritage over past decades, where experts, in inverted commas, increasingly become facilitators rather than arbiters, often though arbitrators in the statutory system, in assessing and articulating significance. I don't think this is challenging the long-established values of significant places, which was an issue that was certainly raised during the drafting of the principles. Rather, those long-valued places are tending to be seen as having more and diverse and more complex values around being recognised around the established ones. More problematic, I think, for natural as well as cultural heritage is how to negotiate the threshold at which the personal becomes the political. What one person or a small group of people, as we all do, value something that really is personal to ourselves and our own small group. At what level in this multivariate world of values does significance identified by an emerging heritage community become a public rather than a purely private interest, justifying and validating constraint under law and policy on the one hand, or investment of public funds on the other? And indeed, could such decisions, in the light of the treatment and, say, the Paris Convention, become portrayed as human rights issues? Issues for discussion, I think, with little wonder perhaps that the UK has not yet ratified the Paris Convention.
Well, thank you very much. It was really helpful, I think, to put it in that broader sort of international context. We now have two presentations from colleagues based in universities, starting off with Richard Higley from Durham.
Thank you. My comments derive from the focus of my current research, which is specifically on the significance of the Roman past and the ways that ideas of origin and descent relate to ancient monuments and landscapes. And just an acknowledgement for this, because some of the ideas I'm discussing today originate with the project on this slide. So how has significance been assessed in the past? How do we assess it today? This is a very well-researched topic in heritage theory. And heritage theory today quite often emphasises the idea that we've focused on tangible and elite heritage in the past. Also that we have a focus on keeping heritage anastic. Trying to fossilise structures which have always been in the process of change at one stage in the process of their collapse. And this is a slide of Higgins Wall from a book by Simon Crow, which, if you can read the caption, actually mentions the extent to which this iconic section of Higgins Wall, which a lot of you will probably know, is actually as much a product of the 19th and 20th century. It's actually a Roman one. So we've sort of edged onto this topic once or twice this afternoon. How real is what we see as tangible heritage? Heritage is what we make it. To an extent, it's what we made it in the past, but it's largely what we make of it today. Now today, there's much more of a focus on the living character of heritage and how people individually make their own heritages and the difficulty of defining any form of authenticity. And heritage today, I suppose, is looking at transformation, and that to an extent is behind a lot of the facts we're meeting. So moving on, I'm going through the questions that are asked in this section one by one. What has been chosen to represent heritage over the last century? How and why? How do things come into public consciousness as being significant? And I think in my subject, in Roman archaeology, there's been a very specific focus on the grand and the elites, both in the monuments chosen to display and also in research and publication. So on the elite of the province, the military sites, the frontier systems, the cities and the villas, the symbols of what Victorians probably would have considered evidence of ancient progress in barbarian society. Now there's been very much of a broadening out of the sort of public agenda and also a broadening out of the archaeological agenda over the last 40 years. And we've had a lot of excavation and publication of sites of varying status, and we've had evidence during categories of people in society, slaves and people who migrate to the province, coming up in quite large quantities. And this has been exploited very effectively by some museums, for instance, and I'm thinking particularly of the Museum of London, but a range of other museums in relation to Roman culture. But we have a particular problem, and I'm not being critical here, right? I don't mean to be critical, that our portfolio of ancient monuments remains elite focused. That's just an issue. I want to think a bit about public consciousness. This is a very complex topic. How do ideas about, in my case, Roman Britain, get into the minds of the public? Largely today it's come through skill education and media, including, and it's been mentioned, digital media. Digital media isn't going to change the way we do things. It has changed the way we should be doing things already. Now, I wonder, I have an interest in certain forms of cultural representation, if you want, but I do wonder how many people who visit Hadrian's Wall today have come across it in Game of Thrones, or even in the Zombie Survival Guide, because both those documents, Hadrian's Wall is quite fundamental to them. How different versions of Britain's past projected through the ways that we view our heritage. I want to provide just one example, and do bear in mind I've only got 10 minutes. The government are pursuing, and have been pursuing, a new agenda for the national curriculum that broadly, very simplistically, focuses on a concept that's been called Our Island Story, an idea that derives from an Edwardian book. And there's been a real furore arising from this debate, since Our Island Story emphasises very much the permanence of national history. Now, one interesting issue, which deeply involves archaeology, is the report that the Runnymede Trust have created in connection and consultation with Operation Black Vote on the national curriculum, which draws deeply on an archaeological project run by Dr. Hella Eckhart at the University of Reading. And Hella Eckhart's project looks at migration. I prefer migration to diaspora, because it is a topic or concept. It looks at the evidence of migration into Roman Britain. And this is one of the images taken from that project. For the Runnymede Trust and the interests they represent, this evidence is fundamental to putting in context the concept of a national curriculum that might focus too much on stability and gradual change in domestic, indigenous life within Britain. But this is very far removed, I think, from the idea of monumental, unchanging, tangible heritage. So how is heritage regarded differently across different communities and constituencies? And can heritage help communities not only to understand their own histories, but also to respect other people's histories? Different communities see heritage in very different ways, and I think this really brings out an issue which we need to think about in detail, this particular project. We don't really know how communities respond to heritage, except in a few limited cases, and this issue has come up already. We don't, on the whole, do ethnographies to establish what are stakeholder communities, or what I might provocatively call descendant communities, and that's a difficult issue in Britain, think about their heritage. And obviously in some cases, Barbara Grender, and a whole range of other people after Barbara Grender, did some wonderful work on Druids and Stonehenge. So in this case, one group of people, quite a complex series of groups of people, we do know quite a lot about how those people think about the monuments that archaeologists sometimes appropriate to themselves. And we also know, unfortunately, that some groups in our society, and I think this is a major issue for us, want to use our heritage in ways that I think everybody in this room would find very disturbing. And we have a duty, I think, and this is really about the national curriculum. I'm not trying to make a crude point here. We have a duty to think about these issues. We have a duty to think about nationalism. If we ignore it, it won't go away. So I think, being positive, we need to find forms of heritage that are relevant to different constituencies, and especially, and this came up in the previous talk, to work with ideas of some form of tolerant heritage. And I suspect that these ideas are going to be about change and flux, as much as they're going to be about stability and continuity. Now, the last question I wanted to respond to, what do we do about the controversial parts of the landscape? And then it goes on to say that are not currently protected. Now, protection is not everything, and I think that's come up several times today. Although I do accept it's a vital part of what we do. Now, considering what I've been talking about today, it might come as a surprise to you, if you don't know me, to know that I worked as an inspector of ancient monuments in Scotland for 10 years before I moved back to university. But the trouble about tangible heritage, in the ways that it's sometimes created at least, it can make heritage seem very monumental, static and distant, something very much about the past. We need to broaden out our agendas, and we need to make sure they're inclusive. And this may lead to opportunities to define and protect new forms of heritage, or to communicate intangible ideas of heritage through the use of sites and finds. And thinking again about the migration issue which I raised during the Hadrian's Wall project, which I referred to in my first slide, one of my co-workers created an exhibition about the people who lived along the wall in Roman times, called the archaeological race. So some of the monuments, if not many of the monuments, in the portfolio of monuments that are available to the public to visit can be useful to this. Now, archaeology can contribute to this in particular ways, or heritage can, by looking at the highly mixed nature of past communities, and by broadening people's appreciations of the opportunities and constraints afforded by life in the past, and how those relate to our lives today. I think it is true that looking at neglected aspects of the landscape should help here, particularly if we can involve communities more in the process of finding archaeology and understanding archaeology, and if we can work hard, and it is hard to do this, to break down all the barriers which exist between, and we've seen some of them today, between practice and between practice and scholarship, within practice, within scholarship, and between all those categories and the publics, or multiple, I should say. And the Heritage Lottery Fund, we're going to hear about them later, have been funding a lot of localised projects which deal with monuments, which raise different issues from the monuments that we have in state care and available to the public. And that exhausts what I wanted to say in my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Our final presentation before we go into a discussion session is Quentin Lewis from Cambridge, who's going to be speaking very much from her perspective as Director of the Access Cambridge Archaeology Project.
Okay, thank you, Mike. The unenviable task of speaking right at the end of the day, so I've been scribbling on my notes all day as people have been making points. As Mike said, my background, I'm an archaeologist, and I have extensive experience of working with the public in lots of different ways, through television when you're reaching millions in the course of an hour, through working one-to-one with individuals over the course of hours, trying to puzzle out a specific problem on a site. I've worked with probably over 10,000 people over the last 7 or 8 years, on a face-to-face basis on various outreach projects. So I'm going to think a little bit about the way that public, that relationship between public, if you like, and significance. Going to those same questions, and like Richard, I structured my presentation through the questions that Richard just addressed, so there'll be some interesting comparison. We've talked a lot about how significance has been addressed in the past and how we address it today, so I'm not going to dwell on that in any great length. Significance is, of course, a value judgment. It's not an absolute quality. Different people perceive significance differently. If you ask anyone, what is significant to you about heritage, you get as many different answers as if you ask them what their favourite colour was. Certainly significance has been ascribed top-down in the past, and equally certainly today in our sort of post-modern paradigm, where we recognise multivocality and multiple narratives and multiple perspectives, we have to question that top-down ascription of significance. The authoritarian patrician judgments are rather out of fashion. But that's not to say that expert knowledge is out of fashion and that it's not recognised and respected. Again and again, I have found that people, the general public from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, respect expert opinion, particularly when they see it being used in ways that make sense to them. So if we're asking, should heritage professionals be seeking to impose significance, should wider publics be allowed to do that now? In the age of the digital media, we could do that. We could have a sort of wiki approach to scheduling, and Wikipedia is one of those bizarre phenomena. It works better than it ought to. I tried to explain this to my father, who has no laptop, no phone, no nothing. But actually Wikipedia is kind of better and more reliable than it ought to be, and I don't think any of us really understand that, but I'm sure we've all used it. Should this mass sort of ascription of significance applied to the protecting process be considered? There's some element of that now. There's a public online available process for applying to have a monument scheduled for English heritage. I have gone through that process myself. It works. Well, it worked for me eventually. It's long-winded, it's difficult, you require a lot of expert knowledge and a certain amount of, I suspect, being able to pull strings. If only to get a reply sometimes. And you also have the problem, of course, with that sort of system. What happens if the answer's no? Just literally the day before yesterday, I was at a public event and someone came up to me, was chatting about other things, but also mentioned that they'd applied to have a site they wanted scheduled and it had been turned down. And they felt rather deflated by this. And this, of course, creates problems potentially of alienating people. We need to do something, I think, probably to merge the boundaries between significant in scheduled and insignificant out, not scheduled. The past, heritage, archaeology, whatever we call it, doesn't exist on that sort of black and white, you're either in or you're out. Everything is on a continuum. And of course we have to ask how we'd reach a decision in the event of conflicting views in a sort of popular wiki approach to scheduling. Sooner or later somebody has to make a decision if there is not an infinite availability of resources, which of course there aren't. Moving on to what's been represent our heritage, I more or less crossed out my entire paragraph on this because it has been discussed, I think, and Richard has just talked about exactly that, and many of the words he uttered are exactly what I've got. The significant sites of the past that have been ascribed as such in the past have tended to be those of the great and the good. They are the elite, and one suspects that the white, powerful male, powerful male, rather, secular community, though, because we don't actually know that it wasn't women building Stonehenge. So I'm not going to talk about that, but we do have to raise this question of whether a significant body of significant heritage is denying people the access to the ordinary. And in fact, that raises the question of which is more important. Are things more significant if they're rare, special, different, elite, amazing? Or are they more significant if they're commonplace, much closer to the ordinary, everyday experience of most people in the past, the present, and indeed in the future? So, I'm now to move on. How do things come into public consciousness as being significant? Because this is something I've a lot of experience of hearing people talking and thinking about this. And there are two ways, really, that people become aware of significance that I've observed. They're either told it's significant, or they have personal experience which leads them to feel that it's significant. And these are two very different approaches, and they really appear to be top down in the first case and the bottom up. So when we're thinking about how different versions of Britain's past are projected through the way we view heritage, the first one is the being told bit. It's the media, which primarily is how people find out about heritage and about significance. And again, it's this top-down approach. Those themselves have evolved over time. We could contrast sort of Civilization and Chronicle, the sort of series of the 60s and 70s, with Time Team and Michael Wood's recent series. Perhaps we should move away from this top-down versus bottom-up to something that's an inside-out way of seeing, ascribing heritage and identifying heritage. And of course new media will change, has changed the way that media-sourced information gets out to people. But of course the problem, if we're looking at the long tail of new media, a mass communication approach, is you lose the detail, the message will get lost in the medium. There'll be so much information around that, nobody will be able to get their head around any of it. You're always going to need somebody to mediate, to translate, to present, to select, if you're going to be able to act, if that's needed. In terms of how heritage is regarded differently across different communities and constituents, this is something we've recently had very direct experience of through an AHRC-funded project, a community heritage project, which was in collaboration with the Heritage Lottery Fund, where community groups were invited to come up with ideas for community projects that were important to them, and they could be about anything to do with heritage. The HLF were very open about that. If the community groups felt it was their heritage, then it was heritage. The AHRC were funding universities, my university amongst others, to support these groups in putting together bids and then in supporting and running the projects. And the variety of projects are really telling. Just in the group, we've got 27 different projects we're sort of supporting at the moment, and they range from creating an oral record of stories about travellers stopping places, archiving farm workers' memories of ploughing with heavy horses before the war, creating stories of female laundry workers to write a new theatrical performance, memories and memorabilia of a football club, a project focused on village housing involving surveying, sounds like more conventional heritage, and making knitted models of them, which is a bit less conventional heritage. But it does bring us closer to the sort of more familiar tangible heritage, or the tangible heritage that's more familiar to many of us here. People wanted to create local history trails, back garden, mass archaeological digs, a sixth form dig, testing out a theory about the line of a local castle ditch, a community dig on a local site which was a scheduled ancient monument. It was considered significant enough to be protected, but nothing was actually known about it. There was no archaeological information about it apart from its physical shape. It was a sort of roundish shape with a bank in the ditch. There was no historical evidence about it at all. And we got scheduled monument consent to do a small excavation, which has transformed not only everyone's understanding of the date and likely function of this site, the preservation of the site there, but also public engagement with that site. And that's one of the key things in terms of how people come to regard these things as significant. But we can see from the range of community heritage projects that we've had, that there is a huge range of different sorts of heritage. But what has been really interesting is because we have worked with these communities as a group, they've come together at open events and at sort of training events we run, they've got to know each other, and people are learning about each other's heritage through meeting people, the people doing the horse people, as we call them, the horsemen, are talking to the sort of women's group doing the laundry workers, who are chatting to the diggers, who are chatting to the people who are wanting to do things about the traveller stopping places. People are finding out about each other's heritage, and because they're doing it through that personal contact, you're talking to someone, prejudices that might exist break down, and things are more interesting. If you're talking to someone who's inspired and interested about their heritage, it's much easier to become interested in it. Their interest conveys itself to you. And we've also found the way that heritage can help communities understand their own history, but other people's heritage, particularly in archaeological digs in places, in living places. Many of you will know I've done a lot of work doing excavations in historic villages, which has long been a research interest, and it is staggering, and it always staggers me, how this draws new people in. You get way beyond what those of us who are familiar in working with local history societies and local archaeological societies might call the usual suspects. The people who often and always turn up to local history society lectures. You get a much range of people with different educational backgrounds, different ages, occupations, different interests, because they're interested in place. They're interested in their place, their neighbour's place, that nosy element. What are they going to find in their garden? What are we going to find in our garden? And then finding out what other people have turned up. And because of that random just digging in your back garden, this follows archaeological procedures, I won't go into those now. But because you're just digging in space that isn't described as being special and significant, anything can turn up, and that is people's individual heritage that they are creating for themselves. They have a sense of connection with it, even if it's just a bit of a slate pencil or a bit of Petford ware, something that's strong they wouldn't even notice before they'd actually taken place as a big group of people all coming together to explore their heritage, to create connections and develop new senses of significance. And one of the interesting things we've noticed when we collect feedback from these people, we've had thousands of people who've done this, 91% of them say that after having done that, they feel more engaged, not just with the heritage of their local area, but with heritage more generally. And that we have as feedback from large numbers of people, that it does, once you engage on one bit of heritage, you feel more engaged with the other. So to conclude, significance is a difficult concept. My heart sank when I saw that I was going to be speaking on this. It is personal, but it is more than personal. There is a meta-significance, as it were, if you like, a shared heritage. This is most mutual in many ways when it's about heritage of place, because place is something we all share, whether we've been there for 5 minutes or 5 generations. And the appreciation of significance is understood through knowledge and association. Therefore, the key obstructions to support the heritage and for understanding the significance come from ignorance and detachment. And these are things that us specialists and those who are not specialists can work together, focusing not so much on educating people, but on everyone learning together about places and the past, to appreciate heritage and understand significance and be receptive to notions of significance. Sorry if that sounds a bit weird.
Different perspectives. Quite interesting. We had two representatives from national organisations where effectively they were particularly looking at significance in relation to thresholds that were defined in legislation. That was put into a very helpful, perhaps more international and value-based, more philosophical approach with Paul. And then we've heard, particularly perhaps in the last two presentations, about more individual, personal, to some extent more community expressions of significance. And one of the issues it seems to create is how we deal with those tensions that are perhaps created by expectations and how we manage those, how we communicate some of those issues as well. We've got about 25 minutes now for discussion before we need to close. We'll follow the format that we've become familiar with, in the sense that it's very much an opportunity for you to put points forward, ask questions of the speakers. If you do so, please could you just wait for the mic to come to you and let us know who you are before you make your point. Who'd like to kick off? We'll just wait for a mic to come to you.
Thanks. I thought there were 4 great thought-provoking presentations, but the point that you've just but I thought, Mike, that you actually captured it quite well in the point that you just made, in that there has always been a fundamental and challenging distinction for us in heritage between those values that we need to take into account in designation in order to hit thresholds and hit those sort of wider justification for the expenditure of public, as Paul put it, public money or regulation, and the pragmatic values that you need to take into account if you're managing a public park. And I always use the sort of analogy of a public park where what justifies it being on the register will not be the value of the local dog walkers, but you ignore the local dog walkers' actual peril. And we've all seen it also with chopping down trees in parks. So I think it's quite useful when we're writing about developing policy or thinking about value to make a distinction between what you take into account when you designate something and the practicalities of managing a place, which is a much broader community thing. So I think it's a good distinction and a valuable one, and one that we shouldn't shy away from or worry about in the least. But we just need to be careful about it, because I've seen too many guidance notes confuse the two. The second thing that was less picked up on, Francis sort of touched on a little bit, is this, and Paul mentioned it briefly, is the line between the value that flows from the investment in heritage, the instrumental benefits, as opposed to the significance of a place. And again, I've sometimes seen that confused. I've seen in Australia people trying to make guidelines that imply that you should take the economic value of a place into consideration when you designate it. And we've all seen politicians try to cross that line. So when we're talking about, I rather talk about value than significance, making a distinction between the value that flows from investing in heritage, which might be the economic value, it might be your house prices that go up, it might be the social value, it might be the environmental benefits that flow, is quite important. So I think that will be the other, almost the paper that was missing, which is the one that talks about the value that flows. But I thought they're all good points. I think when we come back to the discussion earlier on language, what we need is just a little bit of rigor about what kind of value we're talking about and that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Kate, I couldn't agree more about the need to differentiate what you do about things or whether you should be asking the questions in the first place. My former boss, Peter Beecham, with a very clear analogy. Volume 1, is it of importance? Should it be accepted as such? Volume 2, what to do about it? And when you start blurring those two volumes, you get into trouble, because the pragmatic case for considering the consequences about something being protected tend to give ministers the heebie-jeebies. They tend to bring in economic arguments about sustainability and justification of something being protected, all those sorts of things. And I think it actually the government's very considerable credit that they've kept those two things separate. You've got to be mindful of the consequences of your actions. Of course you have. You've got to know what you're wading into. But I think you're right to make that distinction. Volume 1, Volume 2.
Further questions? Yes, just to come back on, I think we're too hooked on the issue of designation, thresholds for designation. And I think the distinction's been blurred, as we've heard, through the Heritage Lottery Fund in the UK. And that widely has always been welcomed by the established heritage community, seeing the established heritage still in the funding. I think it is much more helpful to look at the continuum, as Karenza said, and where the designation happens to fall on that. But designation is no longer the trigger even within the planning system for the recognition of heritage values. What we're trying to get to is heritage values recognised in proportion to their significance. And that, I think, is very difficult, because everyone will have a different view, not only on the types of value attached to the place, but how strong they are, depending on where they live or what their particular interest is. So trying to negotiate these ever more fluid boundaries, when people, having decided something is significant to them, increasingly demand action or form an action group, the bane of the planning system at the moment. These are practical issues, and it's no longer enough to say, well, it's not the threshold of designation. It's becoming more and more difficult all the time.
I think that's a good point, and when you actually think about the way it works these days, if a site is being, or if a planning application goes in, if the system's working correctly, that site will be assessed against the threat on its individual merits and disregarding whether it's scheduled or not, and will be called in for archaeological investigation if it's seen to merit it. And that sort of gets around that significance thing, that the global significance is this site significant or not, or is there enough evidence to suggest that somebody needs to do some work to find out more about it before we decide whether we're going to give planning permission or to put a condition on the planning consent to make sure that's dealt with. And the same person who's had the scheduling application turned down actually spent most of the time talking to me about the field behind his house where there was an application, but building had started and he wasn't aware of any archaeological digging going on. In advance of that, he knew the stuff actually field walked it and found Roman pottery and that sort of thing. And he was, he was going to ring. I said, well, I suggest you ring the council and see what's going on about it. And he was, I suspect, I hadn't done that because he'd been on the phone at 9 o'clock this morning, I suspect. But it's that sort of having people who care enough to see what goes on locally, know enough to know that something could be done, should be done, might not be being done correctly. It's sort of, again, it gets to some extent that problem of deciding whether to ascribe significance or not in the abstract, really.
Yeah.
Right, Ian Morrison, I think the point that Crimson makes is probably true of archaeology in the way it's dealt with in the planning process. I don't think that's currently true of the way buildings are dealt with in the planning process. I think that's still very much on designation. And there have been, to take two examples, I think there is a growth in social media which is having a real impact in the way in which we need to look at significance and the way it's dealt with in the planning process. Two core selects in London this year, which were really focused around heritage. One was the skateboard park and the Undercroft Park, the Undercroft of South Bank, and the other was the Marquis of Lansdowne pub in Hackney. Now, both of those were saved for the nation, if you like, because of a social media campaign, effectively, around local people people that use or had some kind of relationship with those assets, but not because of their designation. Particularly in the case of the Marquis of Lansdowne pub, the heritage sector, particularly the regulatory heritage sector, was paralysed in terms of knowing what to do about it. There wasn't a way that we were able to respond to deal with it. And I think that is a really worrying precedent, or a warning perhaps, of what maybe we may be facing in the future.
So where do we go in the future?
Just to respond to that thing about the heritage sector being paralysed, I wonder if there's anyone in the audience from the property sector. Is there anyone? So, isn't just what we think, it's about what owners, residents, and people like that think as well. So there's a two-way discussion. You do, when you give someone, they yes.
Yes.
John Patel from English Heritage. I just wanted to touch on that point of how the national approaches to assessing significance actually intersect with work that's going on through neighbourhood planning, and whether the information that's kind of gathered, whether it actually does form part of a feedback loop, so that they're each kind of reinforcing each other through sharing of data and information and understanding. And I'm thinking that, for example, in a locality, there may well be some buildings that are of national or even international importance, but they may not necessarily be recognised as such. And similarly, there may be work that's been done through neighbourhood planning that shows that buildings which have so far escaped being assessed or designated or regarded as being important suddenly emerge through that work as being especially significant. How is that information being brought together? And is there a kind of a common language to enable people from those two different perspectives to actually plug into that information so that we're developing over time a more holistic and rounded approach of a place, both in its national level and indeed international terms?
This is not really an area I'm particularly well informed about, but there seems to be a widespread recognition that while the archaeological scheduling might be something to be desired, listing is much more a problem, and the buildings listing really needs to be revised, I think, almost bottom up. I think it was done very quickly, wasn't it, initially, and Everyone seems to feel that that's a great problem, that there's money to put into anything if it's the buildings. But as I say, this is not something I'm terribly well informed about, but it strikes me that's an interesting point.
The problem with listing is that all one had to determine in the survey was whether it was above this notional threshold. Beyond that point, significance falls to be judged at the point change is proposed. The new guidelines will change that, but there won't be statements of significance for most listed buildings for how many decades?
Present race.
Yes.
Your great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren.
So the matter is one of contention from the outset in terms of the owner's aspirations. They will have usually little idea of significance. If they're property developers, they will probably know full well what it is we're going to admit it. But that point of deciding on change starts the whole thing off on a contentious basis, an adversarial basis, which worst case scenario ends in a public inquiry. The government knows this, English Heritage knows this, that's why the ideal is to offer a statement of significance, resources in it. But I think it would do a great deal to improve the public perception and respect for the listing system if we could tell people, as said, why the buildings are listed. Let everyone know who plans to buy the buildings for whatever purpose, why they're listed, rather than simply identifying.
Before we come to London, I'm keen to take one or two more comments at the front of the back there. Then Peter
well, I thought I might respond in relation to neighbourhood planning, because the version of the Westminster City Council, we're actually in the stage where we came through neighbourhood planning in quite a bit of an ambitious way. Prior to Legislative Act coming in, we had 19 registered community societies, which covered the entire blanket coverage of Westminster, most of whom were completely baffled by Liberals and Greg Clark's idea about Westminster, because they basically said they were fully engaged with planning, they had all those opportunities to partake in policy making, and were quite satisfied with consultation and engagement of responses in relation to development happening within the area. And if any building had been lost out in the listing process, they were quite happy to write in the days when it was possible to actually get buildings considered for adding to the list. Current scenario is that we have 22 areas who are attempting to get neighbourhood forum status. You have to go through a two-stage process. Each of the forums, when they are eventually designated, you've only got 4 so far, will then move, if they wish to do so, and they have no requirement to do so, towards making neighbourhood plans for their area. And it's extraordinarily complicated, and it will be quite expensive for them because most of them aren't professionally registered in the sense for doing that piece of work. But as far as recognising anything of significance in their area across the country for anybody who's doing this, and the feedback loop, it in a sense is a local agenda. So although the local authority has a duty to help making sure that the plans are in compliance with the National Planning Policy Framework and also the adopted core strategies for an area, it will be an evolving process. And so if people come forward and say, we've now discovered these particular buildings or sites or whatever it is, and we think they're of interest, if we do a job of consent for local authority, or the professional who's drafting up the plans for them, if that's how they're going to pay for them to be done, to make those link backs. And there's an extra aspect of it, which is community assets. So it may be that they find a building which they feel is significant, but it's not listable. And then they would actually ask for it to be added to the community asset register. But all that means really, practically, is that if anybody came to sell that community asset registered property, they actually have to allow a certain amount of time, can't remember, 6 months, for people to get money together to see if they can buy it. And we've seen that process occasionally happening up and down the country with people buying pubs and changing them into kind of community centres or whatever. So it's actually, I think, sorry, bringing it back to the precise question, there isn't a leap there. It's up to people to kind of either make the leap or Graham, English Heritage, who's in charge of the planning bit of English Heritage, or his own, a couple of people, to try and perhaps, I don't know if they need to register voluntarily and say there's any plan making that might cover those kind of conservation or potentially listable or archaeologically significant aspects.
Okay, thank you. Pete, just in front of you.
Thank you. Peter Hinton, IFA. Mike, I waved my paw in the air because it looked like it was going to be one of those embarrassing silences after John's very sophisticated question, which has now had some sophisticated answers, so my rather simplistic one probably won't help. But part of your question, John, was about how information derived through plan making, neighbourhood plan making, can reach and be reached and be used again. And I'm just going to put in a word for the humble historic environment record, which is one place where information about the 95% of heritage assets that are undesignated is recorded. And I do think it's worth giving them a bit of a plug today, because in the parade of legislation that we've watched go past us today, the one bit of legislation that has been mentioned but once is the 2010 draft Heritage Protection Bill, which Roger had the kindness to mention, but giving it a short eulogy before laying it to rest. And of course we understand the political realities of the situation, but we must remember that one of the provisions of that bill was a statutory requirement for local authorities to have access to a maintained historic environment record, and we are now seeing the consequences of that provision not being passed into legislation, as historic environment records are, in some places around the country, being closed or at least fossilised. So that was my point on historic environment records.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Chris, over at that back there.
Thank you. I feel a fool now because Peter's pretty much said what I was going to say. But taking John's point further, I think this is a profoundly important observation, particularly given what we've heard about digital information exchange and social media. And again, I do think if there's a potential, a suite of potential agendas to take out of this meeting, then the issues around information exchange and information sharing, formally or informally, and particularly with reference to AGRs, is one that we should perhaps prioritise, because the more that is shared authoritatively and openly, then the stronger everybody is in every constituency that cares.
Chris, just a last comment, and then we'll just come to Roger, and then the panel can have last, and then finish the last bit of say.
Chris Costelli from Victorian Society. One of the problems with listing is that for the reasons that Roger set out, the time taken to assess a building is getting longer and longer because it has to be done more and more thoroughly. And yet the resources available are going down. And I'd be very interested in the panel's thoughts on how to square the circle.
Basically, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so we'll just see if any of the panel members want to make any sort of final comments. Maybe Roger want to respond to them.
Yeah, it seems that this thing speeded up. It's actually the case we got through much quicker.
I mean, that's what it takes an individual to assess, not necessarily the time.
Yeah, well, average one of the cases now, 15.87 weeks, as I remember. It used to be a year when I started in a year, 10 years ago. So that's a step forward. Yes, it's full up. I think we're doing a bad job of upholding the ongoing case for there being a designation system. Of course, there's a plurality of values, of course, appreciation goes on shifting. But as I said in my talk, be careful what you wish for. You've got an amazing bedrock of identified significance with protection consequences. And of course, it could be better. The answer does lie, as has been said very, very well by Chris Scull in the AGR, how you hold information. Our contribution to this has been to get the lists online through the NHA. It's an amazing achievement. To the listing system be reformed bottom up, as Lorenzo says. But I'm not sure about that actually. I think a lot of it works, and there are a lot of happy punters who see the very clear protection consequences it brings in. Of course, they're disappointed people. The fundamental split of identifying buildings very precisely versus archaeology, it's ubiquitous nature, it's inchoate nature sometimes, where there is the protection does lie during the planning process. Very, very big difference. So designation is a complicated thing, but as a designation director, I know there's much more to life than just being red marks on maps.
Well, I suppose the thing that I didn't say, and it's maybe triggered by listening to Richard and Carenza, was really to just touch on the National Trust's approach to the fact that we haven't, I think, properly addressed maybe broader landscape history, the business of understanding and respecting other people's history. And my favourite criticism of the Trust in this regard was an article that George Monbiot wrote, I think, in The Guardian, with a fantastic headline, and it said, "Why you will never find an execution on the National Trust tea towel." And I was immediately intrigued, and what he was really talking about was, I suppose, the alternative history of a great estate like Stowe, and about people who've been moved off the land, people who've been sent to Australia, all these sorts of things. And actually, it was absolutely spot on, and I believe with every word. So I think that's an area where the Trust could do a great deal more. I thought our account of during the year of celebration of the Abolition and Slavery Act was pretty derisory. And that's because big organisations with lots of things to do, like the Trust, which is busy managing its affairs, hasn't sufficiently got a research mentality. If we were going to do something credible on that particular topic, we should have designed a research project probably 7 or more years before and started working with various university bodies and indeed colleagues in the Caribbean. So there is a tendency, big organisations are, their time is taken up with other things, not to plan ahead in quite that way. And I think and hope that we can change that over the next few years.
And just to remind us all, there's a statement of significance, is a value judgment. It's always specific to the time, the place that it's made, and the purpose for which it is made. And it's always improved by a range of input. But it remains that mutual and specific thing to its point of life.
Gosh, this is starting to sound like a sort of Miss Will thing, isn't it? I think I'd like to finish really by saying I think the best way to protect heritage is by engaging the public with it, and we can't engage the public with it if they don't understand why things are seen as significant. We have to trust the public because they can be trusted to put the effort in to understand what we're telling them. So it's about communication. I think participation is the most effective way to engage the public. And we can do that at all sorts of different levels. There are lots of very good schemes and projects that have been done, working with school children, working with members of the public, all sorts of people with different backgrounds. It's too often too marginal to the activities of too many of the core organisations. How many of these sort of main statutory bodies and organisations we've heard about today have sort of wider participation as a key aim? I would doubt, in many ways, the universities have had this sort of public agenda tends to be low down and peripheral for a lot of activities, and we should be aware, particularly in the new media age, this is going to come up and bite us on the tail if we don't get ahead of the curve on this one.
I seem to be last. I think, what comes into my mind is a lot of the points I might have made have been made already, but we do need to think about definitions too. We had a bit of debate in the first session this afternoon about what heritage might mean. We had an argument starting up, and I made an observation sort of talking past each other. I suppose the only thing I feel about this session is we're still talking about each other, stop talking past each other. I think
I suppose I'd like to take the opportunity of speaking last just to say that heritage is a very dangerous thing for some ways. I'm just echoing what Karen said a moment ago. We need to conceptualise it, we need to be willing to make difficult decisions sometimes, as well as being able to other people's concepts of their own heritage. Because some people will misuse it, and we do need to be willing to engage with that issue. I don't want to end on a sort of down. Well, I found it very interesting this afternoon, but we need to find some way of communicating across some of the sort of rifts that are occurring in this discussion. We're going to get towards some joint agenda. I think that's my final point.
Okay, well, perhaps half of that is this sort of event where it actually brings together a range of partners from different backgrounds, breaking down some of those silos, and particularly perhaps connect some of the practitioners with the academic research community, which can perhaps provide that discussion and engagement, which I think is clearly very important. Hopefully you've had an interesting session there on the issues of significance. We've only obviously been able to touch on a small number. I'm sorry we haven't had longer to allow more of you to make your own contributions. Clearly, to some extent, we're setting up some of the discussion on the agenda for tomorrow. Hopefully we'll be able to be here, particularly where we're starting to look at issues to do with responsibility and the future of heritage protection. So can we just close by thanking very much all the speakers who contributed in this session, everybody else who's contributed, and obviously all the staff who've made this work very smoothly.